What if I told you there's a berry growing wild along roadsides across America right now that Native Americans used for ink and dye for centuries? Civil War soldiers wrote home with it when supplies ran out. Medieval scribes used elderberry ink in manuscripts that have survived for hundreds of years. The chemical ink industry replaced both of them, not because chemical ink is better, because it could be manufactured, bottled, and sold. Two things explain why almost nobody in the modern world knows. You can make permanent, usable ink from a berry that grows wild in every state east of the Mississippi. One involves the chemistry inside the berry that gives it its color and its staying power. The other involves what happened to traditional craft knowledge the moment a bottled manufactured alternative became available for purchase. By the end of this video, you will understand exactly which berries produce the strongest natural inks, why the ink in Civil War letters that have survived 160 years still holds its color, and how a skill that every farm family in early America possessed quietly disappeared within a single generation, while the chemical industry filled the space it left behind. Think about that for a moment. Not within several generations, not gradually over a century, within a single generation. People who were born in households where making ink from berries was simply something you knew how to do, the same way you knew how to preserve vegetables or mend clothes or read weather from clouds. Raised children in a world where ink came in a bottle, and those children grew up with no knowledge that another option existed. The manufactured alternative did not win because it was dramatically better. It won because it was available in a store. And once it was available in a store, the knowledge of the alternative simply stopped being transmitted. The place to start is not with the chemistry, it is with the letters. In archives and museums across the American South, there are Civil War letters that have survived a century and a half. Letters written by soldiers who were running low on supplies who could not get standard ink, who looked around at what was growing near their camps and did what their mothers and grandmothers had always done. They crushed pokeweed berries, the tall, dramatic plant with dark purple-black clusters of fruit that grows along fence lines and at the edges of fields across the entire eastern United States, strained the juice, and wrote their letters home in the vivid ink that plant produces. These were not desperate last measures taken by men who had exhausted every other option. Many soldiers specifically chose pokeweed ink because it was what they knew from home. The plant was familiar. The process of making ink from it was something they had watched their families do. The South in the 1860s was not a society that bought everything it needed in bottles from a store. It was a society where practical knowledge of what the land provided was still actively held and practiced by ordinary people. And pokeweed ink was part of that practical knowledge. The fact that those letters survive today is not an accident. The ink held Phytolacca americana, pokeweed, also called inkberry in early American records, a name that tells you plainly what the plant was known for before synthetic ink replaced the tradition of making your own. The berries produce a juice so intensely pigmented that it has been used since before written European records of North America begin. The Kiowa used the dried berries for jewelry coloring. The Pawnee made a red paint for decorating horses and clothing. The Mahuna made dyes and inks. Early American settlers dyed cloth with pokeweed by fermenting the berries in hollowed-out pumpkins. By the time of the Civil War, using pokeweed juice as ink was not a discovery or an innovation. It was a known practice skill that ordinary people carried in their everyday knowledge, the way most people today carry knowledge of how to use a search engine. The name inkberry itself tells you something important about how thoroughly this knowledge was once embedded in everyday life. Plants acquire common names from their most obvious, most frequently practiced uses. A plant called inkberry was a plant whose ink-producing property was so central to how people interacted with it that the function became the name. You do not call a plant an inkberry unless making ink from it is simply what you do with it. The way you call a strawberry because you eat it. The name was the knowledge, encoded in the language itself, and then the name disappeared from common use along with the practice it described. Stay with me, because the chemistry of why this works is the part that most accounts of natural ink leave out entirely. The pigment in pokeweed berries belongs to a class of compounds called betalains, specifically beta-cyanins, which produce the intense purple-red-black color that makes the berry stain your hands the moment you crush it. These compounds are genuinely remarkable in their concentration. A single cluster of ripe pokeweed berries produces enough pigment to color a significant volume of liquid. And the pigment itself bonds to paper fibers on contact, which is why pokeweed stains are notoriously difficult to remove from fabric and skin. This bonding property is exactly the same mechanism that makes the ink work. The difficulty of removing it is the evidence that it is fixing to the surface. The beta-cyanins in pokeweed are structurally stable at a range of pH conditions, which means they maintain their color across the slightly acidic environment of most paper without breaking down rapidly. This stability is part of why pokeweed ink has survived in Civil War letters that have been stored, handled, and studied for a century and a half. The chemistry is not fragile. It was never fragile. It was simply replaced before most people in the modern world had any reason to learn that it worked. The permanence of the ink depends on what is added to the raw juice. Raw pokeweed juice used directly as ink does shift color over time, moving from the vivid purple-black of fresh application toward richer, darker tones as it oxidizes and ages. This is not a flaw. It is the same property that makes iron gall ink, the dominant ink of Western manuscripts and official documents from the medieval period through the 19th century, change over time. The Civil War letters written in pokeweed ink that exist in museum archives today are not faded or illegible. They are readable. The writing survived because the pigment bonded to the paper substrate deeply enough to resist the century and a half of light exposure, humidity cycles, and handling that destroyed lesser inks. Adding a small amount of vinegar to raw berry juice slows the color shift and improves archival stability, as the acid helps set the pigment and slows the oxidation that changes the color over time. Adding a binder like gum arabic, the same natural adhesive used in commercial watercolor paints and historically in many traditional inks, improves the flow properties and helps the ink sit on the surface of the paper rather than bleeding into the fibers. Salt added to the fresh juice acts as a preservative, slowing the microbial growth that would otherwise cause the ink to spoil in storage. These additions require no specialized knowledge or equipment. Vinegar, salt, and gum arabic were present in every kitchen and general store in 19th century America. Making a workable, reasonably stable ink from pokeweed berries was a task that required nothing beyond what was already on the shelf. Here is where elderberry enters the story, because pokeweed is only half of the American natural ink tradition. Elderberry, Sambucus nigra, the same shrub whose berries are pressed into elderberry syrup, and whose flowers are made into elderflower cordial, produces ink with different properties from pokeweed but with an equally long documented history. The pigments in elderberry are anthocyanins, the same family of compounds that gives red cabbage, blueberries, and purple grapes their color, and which researchers have studied extensively for their antioxidant properties in food science. In manuscript ink, these anthocyanins produce a color that shifts from vivid blue-purple when fresh toward richer brown tones as it ages, the same pattern of oxidative color development seen in historical iron gall inks. Medieval scribes used elderberry ink in manuscripts that have survived for hundreds of years in libraries and archives across Europe. This is not a claim made in craft blogs or natural living websites. It is a documented fact in the history of manuscript studies, where researchers analyzing historical inks have identified elderberry anthocyanins in texts dating back centuries. The scribes who produced those manuscripts were not using elderberry out of desperation or poverty. They were using it because it was available, it worked, and it produced results that have proven durable across time in ways that many modern commercial inks cannot match. The elder tree itself was one of the most widely used plants in pre-industrial European life. Every part of it served some purpose. The flowers for food and medicine, the bark for traditional remedies, the wood for tools and musical instruments, and the berries for food, wine, dye, and ink. A plant so thoroughly integrated into daily life that its ink use was not a specialty craft, but an ordinary household skill. The same way making jam or drying herbs was an ordinary household skill. The knowledge was simply there, held in every community, until the manufactured alternative arrived and made knowing it unnecessary. Now here is where the story becomes the kind of thing the modern ink industry would prefer you not think about too carefully. The berry you can gather from a wild pokeweed plant at the edge of your yard, or from an elderberry shrub growing in your hedgerow, produces ink that Civil War soldiers and medieval scribes trusted with their most important writings. Letters to families they might never see again, sacred texts meant to endure for generations. The chemical ink industry did not replace these natural inks because natural inks were failing. It replaced them because manufactured ink could be produced at scale, packaged in a bottle or cartridge, and sold at a profit that harvesting wild berries could never generate. Consider what the modern ink supply chain actually consists of. Commercial printer cartridges contain petroleum-derived pigments and carrier fluids manufactured through industrial chemical processes, packaged in plastic housings that are designed to be discarded when empty. A standard printer ink cartridge produces somewhere between 200 and 500 pages before it is exhausted and must be replaced. The cost per page for commercial ink, when calculated honestly, is high enough that ink has become a running cultural shorthand for expensive consumables. The inkjet printer business model is in many cases designed around selling the hardware at a low margin in order to generate recurring cartridge revenue across the lifetime of the machine. The berries on the pokeweed plant growing at the edge of your property cost nothing to harvest. They will grow back next season without any input from you. The ink you make from them requires vinegar from your kitchen, salt from your salt shaker, and a few minutes of crushing and straining. It works on paper. It works with a dip pen or a brush. It costs, quite literally, nothing for the raw material. Think about what that math actually means. Every printer cartridge you have ever thrown away was a product someone sold you to replace something that grew wild in the hedgerow outside your window. Not because the cartridge worked better than the berry, because the cartridge could be patented, branded, and restocked on a shelf. The berry already belonged to anyone who cared to pick it. This is not a romantic claim about returning to simpler times. It is a straightforward observation about what traditional knowledge held, what the industrial supply chain replaced it with, and what it would cost anyone who wanted to recover that knowledge to actually do so. Here is exactly how to make it, and it requires nothing you do not already own or cannot easily find. For pokeweed ink, wait until the berries are fully ripe in late summer or early fall. When they have turned from green to the deep purple-black color that indicates maximum pigment concentration. The berries at this stage will stain anything they touch immediately. Wear gloves. Pokeweed berries are toxic if consumed, but the skin contact involved in making ink is not harmful. The critical precaution is simply not to eat the berries or allow children or pets to access them unsupervised. Crush the ripe berries in a bowl or jar. The juice will flow immediately and abundantly from ripe fruit. Strain the pulp through cheesecloth or coffee filter to remove the seed and skin fragments, leaving the clear, intensely pigmented juice. To this strained juice, add approximately 1 teaspoon of white vinegar per half cup of juice and a small pinch of salt. These additions will extend the shelf life of your ink and improve its color stability over time. For use with a dip pen or brush, the raw juice at this consistency is often workable immediately. For a smoother, more consistent flow that sits cleanly on paper rather than bleeding, dissolve a small amount of gum arabic in warm water and add it to the ink at a ratio of roughly 1 part gum arabic solution to 10 parts berry juice. Store the finished ink in a sealed glass jar in the refrigerator. It will remain usable for several weeks and possibly longer, depending on the preservatives you added and the temperature stability of your storage conditions. The color will be most vivid in the first weeks, and will shift toward deeper, richer tones as the anthocyanins or beta-cyanins oxidize over time. The same process that occurred in the historical inks that have survived in archives for generations. For elderberry ink, the process is identical. Ripe elderberries, crushed and strained, produce a vivid blue-purple juice that follows the same pattern of anthocyanin-based color development documented in medieval manuscripts. Because elderberries are smaller and less dramatically pigmented per berry than pokeweed, you typically need a larger volume of fruit for the same yield of ink. But elderberry shrubs in full fruit produce berries in dense clusters, and a productive shrub yields enough for substantial quantities of ink from a single harvest. One honest note that every source on natural berry inks should include: natural inks made from fruit pigments are not equivalent in every property to modern commercial inks or historical iron gall inks. Exposure to direct, strong sunlight over many years will fade anthocyanin-based colors more than industrial pigments designed for light fastness. For documents meant to survive decades of daily light exposure, natural berry ink requires the same conditions that archival documents have always required. Storage away from direct light and stable humidity. The Civil War letters and medieval manuscripts that have survived centuries were stored in conditions that protected them. Natural ink, treated with the same care, performs accordingly. The knowledge that pokeweed grows in your yard, that its berries produce usable ink, that Civil War soldiers wrote their most important letters with exactly this plant, and that medieval scribes trusted similar berry inks with texts meant to last for generations, is not obscure. It is simply knowledge that the manufactured ink supply chain had no interest in preserving or transmitting. There was no profit in telling you that the fence row was a stationary cabinet. There was significant profit in selling you cartridges instead. The art and calligraphy community has quietly kept this knowledge alive at the margins for exactly this reason. Natural ink making is practiced by artists and calligraphers who prize the unique visual quality of organic pigments, the way colors shift with age and light, the connection to a tradition of mark making that predates the chemical plant by centuries. Craft communities focused on traditional skills have documented the methods, but in the mainstream, the knowledge remains largely invisible, tucked away in the corner of the internet where traditional crafts live, not visible in the everyday conversation about ink and writing supplies. The pokeweed is still growing at the edge of the field. The elderberry is still producing clusters of dark fruit in late summer. The chemistry has not changed in the centuries since the first person noticed that a crushed berry left a stain that would not wash away, and began to think about what else that property might be useful for. What changed was simply that a bottled alternative arrived, and the knowledge of what grew along the fence row quietly stopped being passed down. If you found this genuinely useful, watch the next video and do not forget to subscribe. See you in the next one.